Imagine waking up one day and your whole world is different. Dirt roads replaced by railroads, hand-sewn clothes swapped out for factory-made fashion, and instead of working on a farm, you're clocking into a 12-hour shift with steam engines roaring around you. Sounds wild, right? But that's exactly what happened in America, and it happened fast. In just a few decades, the US went from being a mostly quiet farm-heavy country to an industrial beast pumping out steel, oil, railroads, and more. And no, this wasn't some smooth, peaceful upgrade, it was loud, messy, game-changing, and honestly, kinda chaotic. In this video, we're diving into how it all went down. The inventions, the people, the struggles, and how this industrial explosion shaped the world we live in today. Trust me, it's way more insane than the textbooks ever made it sound. Let's break it all down. So before the smokestacks and steel giants took over the skyline, America was, pretty chill. We're talking about a time when nearly 90% of people lived in rural areas, small towns, villages, farmland stretched as far as the eye could see. Your neighbors weren't coworkers, they were your cousins, your childhood friends, or the guy who helped you fix your roof last fall. Most families ran self-sufficient farms. You grew your own food, raised your own animals, maybe traded with the neighbor for butter or tools. Everything was small scale. If you needed a new pair of shoes, you didn't order it. Online, your local cobbler made them by hand. Same with furniture, clothes, even soap. Technology, pretty much non-existent compared to what came later. There were no tractors, no machines buzzing in the background. Tools were basic. Labor was manual. It was your hands or nothing in transportation. You weren't going anywhere fast. Roads were mostly dirt. Long distance travel meant hopping on a horse, drawn wagon, or maybe a riverboat if you lived near water. Trains, not a thing yet. Planes, don't even joke. Life moved slow, and not always in a bad way. People lived by the rhythm of the sun, working when it rose, resting when it set. Everything was deeply tied to nature and the seasons. Spring meant planting, summer meant hard labor. Winter, you better hope your food lasts. It was quiet, simple, but also limited. Opportunities were scarce, education wasn't universal, and if you were born poor or enslaved, life wasn't just hard, it was brutally unfair. This was the foundation America was built on, and it's exactly what the Industrial Revolution was about to flip upside down. Alright, so how did this peaceful, slow-moving farm life suddenly get hit with a jolt of high-speed progress? What was the spark that flipped the switch? Honestly, it all started with a mess. Let's rewind to the early 1800s when America was still figuring itself out and suddenly got caught in the middle of international beef. The Embargo Act of 1807 basically said, hey, we're done trading with Europe, which at the time was like waking up and finding out Amazon just shut down, imports gone. British goods off the shelves. That meant Americans couldn't rely on Europe for clothes, tools, or even everyday stuff like iron and textiles. So what did they do? They had to make it themselves. This is where that first flicker of industrialization showed up. Not because we wanted shiny factories, but because we had no other option. It was survival mode. And then came the War of 1812, which basically turned the heat up. Once again, British imports got cut off. And this time, Americans realized something. Hold on, we actually can do this on our own. But here's where it gets spicy. Around the same time, some genius-level inventions started shaking things up. The cotton gin, invented by Ellie Whitney, took the slow, painful process of cleaning cotton and turned it into a quick machine job. That meant more cotton equals more textiles equals more factories. Then there was the steam engine, the real game changer. It powered boats, it powered machines, eventually it even powered trains. Suddenly factories didn't have to sit near rivers for water power. They could be anywhere. Speaking of trains, let's talk transportation. Around this time, the transportation revolution kicked off. You got canals like the Brewery Canal opening up huge trade routes. Then came railroads, connecting cities like never before. What used to take weeks by wagon now took days, and that meant goods could move faster, farther, and cheaper than ever before. Put it all together and you get a perfect storm, an economy forced to be self-reliant, a series of genius inventions that made work faster, and a transportation upgrade that connected everything like why a fee? This wasn't just a spark, it was a fuse, and it had just been lit. So now that the match was lit, America didn't just warm up, it exploded into full-blown industrial madness. The first industry to really pop off, textiles. Picture this: New England towns, once sleepy and scattered, suddenly buzzing with massive brick buildings. These were textile mills, powered by water at first, then steam, and inside, rows of machines spinning cotton into thread and fabric faster than human hands ever could. But here's the thing, it wasn't just about the machines, it was about the people. Sin mills were run largely by young women, often teens, pulled in from farms to work in clock out shifts. The rhythm of their lives changed from the sun to the factory bell. Now fast forward a few decades and zoom out, because textiles were just the beginning. Enter the giants. The industrial titans whose names you've probably heard, even if you don't know exactly why. There's Andrew, Carnegie the Steel King. He built massive steel plants that didn't just make rails and bridges, they built cities. And the crazy part, he started from almost nothing. Immigrant kid. Work as a bobbin boy in a cotton factory, ended up controlling one of the most powerful industries on earth. Then there's John D. Rock, Sam the oil guy. He didn't just find oil, he dominated it. His company, Standard Oil, refined something like 90% of the country's oil at its peak. He figured out how to squeeze profits from every drop, pipelines, refineries, even his own barrels. The man was a system, and we can't forget Cornelius, Vanderbilt the railroad mogul. Before him, the US was like a bunch of disconnected islands. He built railroad empires that linked them together. Goods could be shipped coast to coast. People could move faster than ever. It turned America into a connected machine. But what made all this possible, the backbone of it all, was mechanization. Machines didn't get tired. They didn't take lunch breaks. They could do the work of 10 people in half the time. And when assembly lines came into play, that changed the game again. Now workers didn't need to know how to build an entire product. They just had to repeat one step over and over. It was faster, cheaper, and scalable. What once took weeks to craft by hand was now rolling out by the thousands. Steel beams, oil drums, cloth, trains, tools, you name it. America wasn't just making things, it was becoming a machine that made machines. By this point, America wasn't just building big things, it was building fast. And suddenly, for the first time in history, distance stopped feeling so distant. Let's start with the railroads. Before them, traveling from New York to Chicago could take weeks by carriage or boat. After them, you could hop on a train and be there in just a couple of days. Goods that once spoiled on the road, fresh meat, fruit, even ice, could now be shipped across states. Farmers in Nebraska could sell corn to factories in Boston. Cattle ranchers in Texas could feed people in New York. It wasn't just about trade, it was about people. Imagine this, families finally reuniting, letters turning into visits, soldiers heading home, immigrants moving west to start new lives. It was freedom on tracks. The railroads didn't just connect places, they built towns. Every major stop became a city hub. Restaurants, banks, factories, they all popped up around the train stations. You could argue the railroad was the spine of America, and everything else just grew around it. But the revolution wasn't just rolling on the ground, it was flying through the wires. In comes the telegraph, the first time people could communicate instantly across huge distances. It's hard to imagine now, but before this, sending a message meant waiting days or even weeks. Suddenly, with a few taps, you could send a message from Boston to San Francisco in minutes. And later, the telephone. Invented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1976, now voices could travel, conversations could happen in real time. These two inventions, the telegraph and the telephone, didn't just speed up communication, they changed how people did business, how they built relationships, even how they ran entire cities. And speaking of cities, urban growth went into overdrive. Why? Because now cities were linked. A job in Pittsburgh didn't feel so far from your family in Cleveland anymore. A shipment from Stelloise could be tracked and expected by the hour. This wasn't just infrastructure, it was life upgraded. The country was now connected literally and emotionally, and there was no going back. So yeah, the trains were running, factories booming, cities glowing with light, but behind all that, there were millions of people working tirelessly in difficult conditions, and not all of them had it easy. Imagine a young girl, let's call her Annie, waking up before sunrise in a New England mill town. She works long shifts in a noisy textile factory. The air is thick with cotton dust. Her fingers move quickly, because if she slows down, she risks losing her job. She's not alone. Many young workers were employed in tough jobs. They worked in factories, helped with construction, and did tasks that were physically demanding. They earned very little for their efforts. Adults were also facing tough conditions. Many workers, especially immigrants, were given exhausting and dangerous jobs. Steel mills felt unbearably hot, and mines were risky environments. Meatpacking plants could be unsafe, and even small mistakes could lead to injury. Long hours, low pay, no safety regulations. No healthcare, no time off, and if an accident happened, you were easily replaced. And here's the wild part, this way of working was seen as normal at the time. It wasn't something hidden away, it was how things were done. But eventually, things started to change. That's when labor unions began to rise. At first, they were small, local, and easy to shut down, but as more people became frustrated, they started organizing, pushing for better hours, higher wages, and safer working conditions. One of the turning points was the Haymarket Riot of 1886. A peaceful protest in Chicago turned chaotic when a bomb was thrown. In the aftermath, several people lost their lives, and the event sparked a nationwide conversation about labor rights. The early strikes didn't always succeed. Many times, they ended in violence, arrests, or worse, but they sparked a movement. They showed that workers had power, even if they didn't own the factories, and perhaps the most important thing they proved, that progress is only meaningful when it includes fair treatment and protections for all workers. By the late 1800s, the factory floor wasn't the only thing getting crowded. Entire cities were exploding. New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh. They didn't just grow, they boomed. In just a few decades, small towns turned into sprawling urban jungles, swallowing up farmland and pulling in millions of people chasing jobs, opportunity, and survival. And it wasn't a quiet transformation. Imagine walking through Lower Manhattan in the 1880s. The clatter of horse-drawn carriages, shouting vendors on every corner, the smell of coal smoke and fish markets blending into one weird urban perfume, kids darting through alleys, washing lines strung between crammed buildings, steam rising from manhole covers. These cities were alive, but they were also struggling to keep up. With the sudden surge in people came massive problems, and the biggest one, housing. You had families packed into tenement buildings, tiny brick blocks with barely any light or ventilation. Sometimes a family of 6 shared a single room, and that's not an exaggeration. Census records prove it. Sanitation, a disaster. Streets filled with trash, water systems overwhelmed, disease spread fast. If one person got sick, the whole building was at risk. In fact, outbreaks of cholera and typhoid were common in these poor, overcrowded neighborhoods. And here's where the social layers start to stack up. While the poor were jammed into tenements, a new group was rising, the middle class. These were clerks, managers, shop owners, people who weren't rich but weren't living hand to mouth either. They had gas lighting, running water, maybe even servants. They read newspapers, went to plays, started talking about proper society. So in the same city, you could have immigrants sewing clothes by candlelight in a basement, and just a few blocks away, a family eating dinner by gas lamp, talking about sending their son to college. The city was becoming a microcosm of class, where your zip code could mean the difference between bare survival and upward mobility. And while it was messy, dirty, and loud, it was also magnetic. Cities became powerhouses of innovation, culture, and opportunity. And once people arrived, they rarely left. This urban wave wasn't just a side effect of industrialization, it was the engine of it. The more the cities grew, the more workers, businesses, and ideas collided. And that friction, that chaos, that's what made modern America. So, with all this craziness, the packed cities, the brutal jobs, the booming industries, you'd think the government would have been all over it, right? Nah, not even close. Back then, the US followed something called laissez-faire capitalism. Note of fancy French for, let the businesses do whatever they want and don't get in the way. And for a while, that meant no rules, no limits, and definitely no regulators peeking behind the curtain. What happened? Simple, the rich got crazy rich, and companies started swallowing up their competition like it was lunch. Enter monopolies and trusts. Imagine if Amazon bought every single online store, or if Google owned every search engine, social platform, and your phone. That's what was happening back then. You had guys like John D. Rockters, who didn't just sell oil, he owned the oil industry. Or Andrew Carnegie, who controlled steel from the mines to the rails. These weren't just companies, they were empires, and the public started noticing. Prices were rigged, small businesses got crushed, workers had no power. That's when the government finally said, all right, enough. In 1890, they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first real law that said, hey, if your company gets too big and starts acting like a bully, we can break it up. And at first, not much happened. The law existed, but no one really used it. Until a certain mustached president showed up, Teddy Roosevelt. Yep, the guy with the national parks and the big stick became the first real trust buster. He went after giants like Standard Oil and Northern Securities, dragging them into court and forcing breakups. To put it simply, Roosevelt was the first guy who actually had the guts to say, monopoly. Yeah, I don't think so. That moment marked a turning point. The government shifted from being a passive bystander to an active player, shaping the economy, protecting competition, and slowly, very slowly, making business a bit more fair. So what happens when a country goes from farms and candlelight to factories, steel, railroads, oil, and booming cities in just a few decades? It doesn't just change the country, it reshapes the world. By the early 1900s, the United States had officially become an economic powerhouse. You're talking massive production, booming exports, and industries that could rival and even beat the long-standing European empires. America wasn't just feeding itself anymore, it was feeding the world with machines, textiles, steel, weapons, and raw ambition, and it didn't stop there. With economic muscle came military strength. The US started building a navy, flexing its influence, and getting involved in international politics. You could almost hear the rest of the world going, wait, where did this kid come from? Industrialization gave the US the tools and the confidence to step into global affairs, and that laid the groundwork for everything that followed. Second World War, World War E, the Cold War, even modern geopolitics. None of that happens the way it did without this insane burst of industrial power. In a sense, industrialization didn't just build cities and factories, it built America's global identity. It turned a young, raw country into a player on the world stage, and eventually, the leader of it. But hey, not everything about industrialization was a win. While America was busy becoming a global powerhouse, something darker was brewing in the shadows. Pollution was everywhere. Factories churning out products were also churning out smoke, toxic chemicals, and waste. Fears ran black with oil, and the air in cities like Pittsburgh was thick with smog. It wasn't just a nuisance, it was health-threatening. People worked long hours in factories with no ventilation, breathing in dangerous fumes. Children often worked right alongside adults, breathing the same toxic air. The working conditions, brutal. Sure, some people got filthy rich, but the majority were living in poverty. Factory owners and industrial magnates became robber barons, hoarding wealth while workers had to scrape by on low wages and endure dangerous jobs. But here's the catch. Some of these same tycoons were also known as captains of industry, people like Rock. Carnegie and J.P. Morgan. They built empires, sure, but they also donated millions to charities and schools, so were they villains or heroes? It's complicated. On one hand, they changed the world. On the other, their success came at a cost. They didn't mind exploiting workers, cutting corners, and creating monopolies to keep the money flowing. Meanwhile, the vast majority of people were stuck in slums and struggling to survive. And those slums, they were the backdrop to this rise of industrial wealth, overcrowded tenements, no running water, dangerous alleyways, and crime. It wasn't the American dream for everyone, in fact. As the rich got richer, the poor got poorer, leading to widespread social unrest. People started to wake up to the inequality that industrialization brought with it. Workers protested, strikes broke out, and cities were filled with angry voices demanding better treatment. The optimism that came with rapid growth wasn't without its glaring problems. The dream of progress was built on exploitation, inequality, and a polluted landscape that would take generations to clean up. So, let's step back for a moment. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change America, it changed the entire world, from self-sufficient farms and small towns to a network of factories, railroads, and towering skyscrapers. It was a transformation that took just a few decades, but reshaped every corner of society. It brought immense wealth, but also immense inequality. It made America an industrial giant, but also polluted the air and created dangerous working conditions. But that's the thing with revolutions, they don't happen without a cost. What we're seeing today in modern industry, with tech giants, artificial intelligence, and automation is just the latest chapter in a story that began more than 200 years ago. In many ways, the legacy of industrialization lives on, in the way we innovate, in the companies we build, in the way we think about progress. We've traded factories for silicon chips and coding, but when you look at how AI is advancing, how tech monopolies are reshaping industries, and how we're dealing with modern ethical questions, you start to see the same themes. Are we headed down the same path of unintended consequences, just in a more digital form? The world we live in today is built on the foundations laid during that frantic, fast-paced industrial rise, and as we look forward to the next revolution, whether it's in tech, climate, or space exploration, we should remember the lessons of the past. So take a moment, reflect. Think about how far we've come and where we're going, because the story's not over yet.